What I will present today is part of my PhD research. It's the final article of my PhD dissertation. My PhD research was part of a bigger international project where we looked at the global spread of accountability policies, trying to understand why these policies are spreading globally and trying to understand how these policies are implemented and with what effects. And this bigger project was conducted in different countries, also in the Netherlands, but my own PhD research was focused on Norway. So what I will present today is I'm focusing on how Norwegian school principals are reflecting on and responding to performance-based accountability demands. So the starting point of the study is basically the observation that we see that rising concerns about the quality, about the efficiency, about the equity of education systems are putting pressure on policymakers to reform education systems. And we see that policy principles such as decentralization, learning standards, accountability take a central role in education reforms worldwide, basically as instruments to modernize the education system and to raise the performance. And increasingly in recent decades, we see that these policy principles are integrated in a sort of coherent reform approach based on large-scale standardized evaluation instruments, standardized tests, and performance metrics. So what this often implies is that on the one hand, lower government levels and schools are given more decision-making power, more responsibility for organizational and pedagogical decisions, while on the other hand, these actors are increasingly held accountable for the extent to which they obtain or achieve centrally defined learning objectives, which are measured by standardized tests. So it's often, this reform approach is often referred to as performance-based accountability, and it implies the use of standardized tests to measure the performance of schools and to hold educational actors accountable. The idea behind it is basically to ensure that educators are responsive to and assume responsibility for achieving these centrally defined learning goals, and also to promote data-driven decision-making. So the idea is also that educators use achievement data to reflect on and to improve their educational practices, and so to improve learning outcomes in the end. Well, what we see quite recently is that performance-based accountability has become a near universal trend. It's really being adopted by many countries around the world, characterized by very different political institutional regimes, education systems, level of economic development. And this has led some scholars to refer to that we're seeing a shift in the governance of education, so a shift from professional to performance-based accountability. But even though this might be a universal trend that we're seeing, the format in which performance-based accountability is adopted in different contexts can differ quite a lot. So there are contexts where performance-based accountability is introduced with quite significant accountability consequences, meaning that teachers or school leaders face quite significant consequences on the basis of how they perform, how their school performs. So for example, school closure or hiring and firing decisions or financial incentives, while in other countries, these type of consequences are absent or are less significant. They're often referred to as low stakes accountability context compared to high stakes accountability context. This is quite noteworthy, the fact that performance-based accountability is spreading, in part because when we look at the evidence in terms of the benefits that this reform approach produces, the evidence is relatively weak and still quite inconclusive and even contradictory in terms of the effects of performance-based accountability on learning outcomes and on educational inequalities, for example. And what we also see is that policy enactment, so the way in which these policies are put into practice by educators, for example, can differ from policy intentions. Sometimes it can even contradict the action theory that informed the policy in place. So we see that performance-based accountability is generating mixed results, and the impact on school organization and instructional educational practices is quite different. So we see high level of variation in school responses. There are educators that choose to adapt their practices to meet accountability expectations, but there are also those who choose to respond by ignoring or avoiding or resisting these policy demands. We see also schools that tend to rely on quick and visible solutions, for example, as a way to respond to accountability demands, rather than the thorough or long-term changes that are anticipated or expected by these policies. And of course, it's quite well known that performance-based accountability has the opportunity or the possibility of generating a number of side effects and opportunistic behavior. So in terms of side effects, you can think of teaching to the test and curriculum narrowing. And in terms of opportunistic behavior, you can think of behaviors such as cheating or student selection or cream skimming. So the effects are quite varied. And initially, in accountability literature, a very common assumption was that, in particular, opportunistic behavior and side effects are likely to emerge in these high-stakes accountability systems. So when there's really something at stake for teachers and principals, so they might run the risk of losing their job, or they run the risk of seeing their school closed down. This is generating so much pressure that they might adopt this type of opportunistic behavior. But when we look at recent evidence, we see that the claim that side effects and opportunistic behavior are predominantly found in high-stakes systems is actually not valid anymore, you could see. The current literature is characterized by a very strong emphasis on high-stakes accountability systems. So these are these systems that you, for example, find in the UK, in the US, and Chile. So they're very significant accountability consequences attached. But there's a growing body of evidence that also looks at what is happening in other contexts. So, for example, a context where there are low stakes attached to accountability and to performance. And what is appearing from those studies now is that some of the side effects that we previously thought were exclusive to high-stakes systems are also appearing in these systems. So, for example, we see now the documentation of teaching to the test, educational triage, and curriculum narrowing also in other contexts, and in contexts where these high-stake consequences are absent. So a gap in the literature is, on the one hand, there's still too big of a bias in favor of these high-stake systems, as found in, for example, the UK and US and Chile. Okay, there are more and more studies conducted in other contexts as well, but in these contexts, it is still unclear how exactly educators respond to accountability demands, in particular when there are low stakes attached, but also how we can explain their responses and how we can explain the documentation of side effects in these contexts, because in this case, we cannot attribute them to the consequences attached to the accountability system. So there are a number of hypotheses put forward in the literature about how we can explain, for example, these side effects and opportunistic behavior in low stakes contexts. And one of the hypotheses that is put forward is that side effects might form a systematic problem of accountability in education. They will occur even regardless of whether you attach consequences or not. They are part of this form of accountability. When you introduce it, they are likely to emerge. It is also put forward that side effects might have something to do with the power of numbers. So the fact that the explanation is put forward that standardized tests in itself cause a shift in the way actors in the educational field think and talk about education, and that could explain the emergence of these effects. But we still don't know enough about whether this could be valid explanations of what we're seeing. So this was the starting point of my own study. What I wanted to know is, in what ways do Norwegian principals perceive and interpret and translate performance-based accountability demands? What are the response patterns? So how do they respond to address PBA demands, performance-based accountability demands? And what are the social mechanisms and contextual conditions? So think of, for example, the local policy context, the local accountability regime, school-specific factors, and personal trajectories that can explain the response patterns and the differences among them. So theoretically, this study was informed by, on the one hand, the policy enactment perspective, which puts forward the idea that putting policy into practice is not something that can be understood as a very linear or straightforward mechanical process, but rather as something that is really dynamic and non-linear and negotiated. Putting policy into practice is done by different actors at different levels. So think of, for example, the municipality, the school, the classroom, And all these actors are involved in making sense of, in interpreting and translating relatively abstract policy texts often into complex ways, into practice. And in doing so, they are enabled as well as constrained by their local context and their school-specific factors. So this implies that we'll often see a lot of variation in terms of how policy ideas are put into practice. Then I combine this perspective with the perspective or with the sociological concept of reactivity. The assumption is that because people are reflexive beings who continually monitor and interpret the world and adjust their actions accordingly, social measures are reactive. So that means that the fact that these social measures are there is likely to generate a response, because individuals tend to adapt their response in reaction to being evaluated, observed, or measured. That is the basic premise of the reactivity concept, basically. And it tries to understand how individuals alter their behavior in response to being measured and evaluated and observed. So in terms of contextual background, why was Norway an interesting study to conduct this research? On the one hand, it has to do with that we have seen a transformation in school governance in Norway. It used to be a system where there was a lot of trust in the profession, and the profession enjoyed very high levels of autonomy. A main or a key way of ensuring education quality was by significant investment in teacher education, as well as by quite detailed curriculum guidelines, but still teachers had quite a lot of interpretive leeway to adapt their teaching to how they saw fit. And there was very limited use of external assessment to see what was coming out of the education system. And this was something that was noticed quite early. In 1988, the OECD wrote a country review for Norway, basically asking, how can you govern your system when you don't know what is coming out of it? There was very little use of external tests. There were exams at the end of lower secondary education and upper secondary education, but that was it. In primary education, there was basically nothing. There were also no grades. So nobody really knew what was coming out. This changed with the turn of the millennium, when the first PISA results were released. I mean, this was at a time when Norway had a lot of confidence in its system. When you talk to policymakers, many say, we thought we had the best education system in the world. But then PISA came in 2001, and Norway performed around the average, even though they were used to being on the top of rankings that you want to be in the top of. And they weren't, and this created a big shock. And at that moment, the call for external assessment of student learning outcomes got really intense, and it eventually also led to the adoption of a national quality assessment system. So standardized testing were introduced, even though they had a very controversial history in Norway, and they were attached to an outcome-based curriculum. So these standardized tests really became a very central steering device, trying to monitor and trying to control whether educators and whether schools were achieving the basic skills that were formulated as competency objectives in the national curriculum. And these policy changes went hand in hand with the devolution of responsibilities to lower government levels and schools. A second reason why Norway is interesting is, okay, we see that current policy documents really put a lot of emphasis on learning and basic skills. The national test the basic skills as main missions for schools. And national test and value-added models are increasingly used to hold educators and schools accountable for the extent to which they succeed in achieving these skills. What makes Norway interesting is that it differs from those systems that have been over-researched, you could say, because in Norway there are no. Norway is characterized by a relative absence of material consequences and low levels of marketization. What is at stake for educators is, on the one hand, administrative control. So the municipal superintendent is the formal account holder, and they are the ones who have meetings with the principal, where the principal is asked to justify why particular results were obtained, but there tend to be no consequences. It's just a matter of having to justify and explain. Also, the results are published, so everyone has access to the results. But because school choice is restricted in the Netherlands, it's not, parents, for example, can't use the results to choose schools. So they're out there, but parents have a limited opportunity to really do something with the results. Of course, they can go to the school and complain, but they can't really use it to exercise school choice, in most municipalities at least. And then finally, the system relies on the expectation that educators use the achievement data to reflect on and improve their practices. So there is still a sense of trust in the profession that they will do so, regardless of whether there are sanctions or incentives attached to that. But what makes Norway interesting is that there's a lot of local variation in accountability regimes. So municipal superintendents can decide what type of accountability instruments and what type of accountability consequences they use. And here we see that there are a number of municipalities that are really raising the stakes. So there are municipalities that are now using performance contracts and even performance-based pay, even though this is still in a different version than, for example, found in the United States. In Norway, yes, it is used for performance-based pay, but test scores are only one of the indicators that inform whether someone will get a raise or not. Then finally, we see that there's variation in the role of third-party account holders, so the role that parents and the media can play. So parents, as I mentioned, school choice is generally restricted, but there are municipalities where parents get some get some space to move around, if possible. So where school choice regulations are relaxed, so to say. So even though priority will always be given to a student that comes from the neighborhood school, in case there is another spot, parents can apply for it using the right to school choice. And then finally, we see that the role of the media differs quite a lot. This is based on a systematic analysis of the media that we did across Norway to understand how different local newspapers report on standardized testing. And there are municipalities where you see that the way local newspapers report on standardized testing is very much characterized by explicit debating and critique and all kinds of arguments, while in other municipalities, media coverage is really characterized by performative-oriented ranking. So it's just publishing rankings, and it's promoting national tests as valid measures of education quality. So this local variation makes Norway a very interesting context to understand how different accountability configurations, as well as different policy contexts, mediate these enactment processes. So the analysis relies predominantly on qualitative data, which are derived from 23 in-depth interviews with school principals, which were conducted between May 2019 and March 2020. The sampling of schools, I followed a two-step sampling procedure. So first, I sampled municipalities. All of the municipalities are urban because the project had a specific interest also in competition dynamics. But the municipalities are spread around the country, located in 8 different counties. And I sampled them by classifying municipalities according to their local accountability regime, so according to the type of accountability instruments and consequences that are in place, as well as the level of involvement of third-party account holders. So the idea was to create some variability here, to get a better idea of how these local contexts mediate policy enactment processes. And then within these municipalities, I sampled schools according to school performance, which was based on secondary data, and then survey data, so the reported performative pressure level, which measured the extent to which principals experience pressure to obtain high results, the reported reputation, and the reported pressure to maintain enrollment. Ideally, I would have used here a 5th sampling criteria, which would be a proxy of the social composition of the student population of the school. But this type of data is not available in Norway. It's really hard to get to, so this was not possible. So school performance was in that sense used as a proxy for the social composition because these two tend to correlate. And after and during I conducted the interviews, it was found that indeed the sample is characterized by a lot of by significant variability in student composition. So here you see, for example, the predominant socioeconomic status of the student population, as well as the percentage of minority language students. And in terms of the sample of principals, this was also characterized by variety in gender and in years that the principal had worked as a school leader. So this varied, I think, between 4 to 26 years. I can explain more about the sample and about the data analysis, of course, but I will leave this for the Q&A if there are questions about this. So the main findings, when analyzing the interview data, it appeared that principals held quite different perceptions and interpretations of the following. So first of all, there are general conceptions on the path to school improvement, as well as their perception of national tests as valid, fair, and useful measurements. So there are principles that perceive the national test as a valid measure of school quality, and there are those that question this, and they are generally quite critical of the national test and quite skeptical towards them. And then finally, I noticed that principles differ in the importance they ascribe to the achievement of basic skills compared to other educational goals and purposes. So basically how much emphasis they place on academic achievement as a core school priority, so to say. And based on these different perceptions, and these different perceptions and interpretations tend to guide the way principals translate, principals respond to policy demands. And analyzing the data this way, I was able to identify 3 distinct response patterns into how principals respond to accountability demands. On the one hand, alignment, which means that principals try to adapt their practices so to meet accountability expectations. Balancing multiple purposes, there you see, yes, for example, a very positive attitude towards the use of achievement data for school improvement purposes, but these principles tend to reject a prioritization of academic performance over other school purposes and other competencies. And then finally, there's a group of principles that tends to hold very critical attitudes towards national testing and accountability system, and predominantly respond symbolically to the expectation to aim for higher test performance and to use achievement data for school improvement purposes. So I will explain them a bit more in depth, and I will also use the reactivity framework to try to explain why this response is being adopted. So the first response pattern is those principles who tend to align to the accountability system. They tend to perceive national tests as valid measures. They also tend to perceive basic skills really as crucial competencies that students need in order to obtain further education and improve their life chances. It was formulated by one principal in the following way. So if children cannot read, write, and calculate, then they do not manage their life. It is important to know that these principles, many of them were working at low-performing schools, working with student population with a high number of disadvantaged students that often started primary education without speaking Norwegian at home, so with some difficulties there. And for these principles, it was really important to at least get them really to learn these basic skills, because that was perceived as a way to give them a chance to get ahead in life. Principals also tended to speak about having to take responsibility and being held accountable for learning outcomes as something that they considered natural and positive. They were also generally quite positive towards administrative control, so the fact that they had to justify and explain their performance. So one of them, for example, mentioned, "I was told that I got 3 years to get good results at this school. My boss said it clearly, and that is how I like it." So they were quite positive towards having to explain and having to justify their performance. Even though there are these external actors that ask them to justify their performance, the pressure that they themselves felt was largely self-imposed. And this seemed to derive in particular from this internal sense of duty to bring about high academic achievement, and so not to let their students down by allowing for suboptimal improvement. So one principal said, "We probably do it to ourselves, I think. I do not think there are many principals who have no ambition to do well. So you put some pressure on yourself to do well and try to find methods, try to find the methods to boost results. After all, I have to admit, if I had bad results, I would feel that I have not delivered. I would go home with stomachache. It touches me." So the ambition to obtain high academic results defines the school vision and organizational goals. In one case, it was mentioned, okay, we've laid far below the national average. So my ambition, the ambition of the principal, was to turn the school around, to think less about the multicultural identity of the school and more about academic content. And this has quite a big impact on how on school organization and pedagogical practices, for example. It also sometimes, these type of ambitions are also sometimes formulated in the form of specific performance targets. So this is, for example, an example. The second quote is an example of a school vision statement where it is argued, okay, our goal is for as many pupils as possible to learn as much as possible. This means we will never be completely satisfied. Municipality X performs the best in Norway. Our goal is to be at or above municipality X. So what we see in this school is, in these type of schools, is that data analysis efforts are highly routinized, and test data are used for multiple purposes. For example, to distribute resources, to assess and compare teachers' performance. On the basis of that, to move around staff members, to make sure that the best teachers are right before, at the grade level, right before the students are tested, to make sure that that the students obtain these competencies. To decide on school focus areas and improvement plans, also to identify learning gaps, to identify which students are struggling and which students might need extra help. Also to find out what works, so to get a sense of what methods and practices might result in higher student learning, and also to determine which content areas should receive more attention. So for example, if it turned out that, that all students performed very poorly at one particular task, then the school might decide to put more emphasis on those particular skills or that particular content that was tested. So to understand this response pattern, it's important to understand that principals increasingly see these test performance as a proxy of the extent to which they succeed in giving their students a chance to get ahead in life. So a proxy of their professional success, you could say. And you can interpret it as an internalization of norms that are embedded in standardized tests as to what counts as the relevant purposes of education. And this quote makes that clear. One principal mentioned, for example, the tests give us a good clue as to what teaching should contain. Not that we should teach to the test, but it does give us some guidelines regarding what to emphasize, what is important for kids to learn. So the tests are now used to get an understanding, okay, what are the important purposes of education that we should focus on. Then the second response pattern is employed by principals who also perceive the national test as valid measures of school quality. This response pattern is employed by principals that are working at schools that differ quite a lot, both in terms of performance and in terms of social composition. So they're both low performing and high performing and average performing schools in this category. But what kind of ties them together, so not necessarily an overlap in school specific factors, but more an overlap in principals' positive attitude towards the use of achievement data for school improvement purposes. So it's often framed that the tests have improved a lot and they can tell principals a lot about how they're doing. So one principal mentioned, for example, national tests, I think, are a tool. After all, we need some assessments that can help us along the way. I think national tests help us to see how we are doing, and the tests have become much better. At the same time, even though they are quite positive towards the use of achievement data, they are much more critical towards a prioritization of academic competencies over other competencies. They still see other competencies that are not tested as equally important. And a very prominent sentiment among these principles is that the Norwegian school has never been only about learning, but equally about bildung. what we see is that principals use these national tests to reflect on, okay, where are we? And these relative performance comparisons form very important reference points for them to reflect on whether schools are on track. So they see, as this principal is saying, the most important thing about the national test is an internal use, it's an internal medicine. And in that context, it's okay to compare yourself to other schools and other municipalities to see, are we in the right place? Are our students weaker than others? So this can provide knowledge about the need to put in extra support in some areas. So there is quite a lot of collective reflection on these comparisons, on a comparison with other schools, but also comparisons with the school's previous performance. And on the basis of that, for example, it turns out that a school is underperforming compared to the neighboring schools, or compared to how a school previously was performing, then a number of decisions can be, a number of actions can be undertaken. So, for example, these type of reflections can be used to revisit the distribution of resources, to offer teachers to take part in professional development courses, to put more emphasis on particular educational content, to set up intensive courses for low-performing students, or to make adaptations to teaching methods. So there is quite a lot of use of achievement data, but this process of decision-making is based on dialogue and collective agreement. So it's not the principal enforcing, we are going to do this. There is still a lot of dialogue and discussion with teachers. Do you think it's a good idea to do this? And test data is one of the sources of information that is used. It's not the only source, it's not necessarily the main source. It's one of the sources of information that influences, that is part of these discussions about how to promote school improvement. And you see that in their vision statements and also in their educational projects and their school improvement plans, there is quite a balanced focus on academic and social development, even in the case of underperformance, for example, on standardized tests. So this response pattern was for this reason classified as balancing multiple purposes. So in a sense, there is some agreement with the conception of successful school that is embedded in standardized testing and PBA, but principals still reject a prioritization of academic performance over other competencies. But what you see, what sparks their response is this precise hierarchy of schools that standardized testing creates. This hierarchy is increasingly used to evaluate how the school is faring and to assess progress and to determine if a school is on track. On the basis of this, decisions are taken accordingly, but always collectively. Then the final response pattern is employed by principals who have significant concerns about the validity of the national tests. This often goes together with a general skepticism regarding the often proclaimed superiority of standardized quantitative data over particularistic ways of knowing, for example. These principles not only perceive the test as invalid, but also as a very narrow measure of school priorities. So they really support a broader approach to learning, and they place strong emphasis on the humanistic aims of education, arguing that if we get bad at that, it's dramatic, both democratic and socially. And what you see is, rather than putting pressure on themselves to attain high academic results, principals tend to put pressure on themselves to make sure their students feel safe and have a good time at school. Finally, the tests are also perceived as a measure of external control, and the information provided by the test is perceived as of limited use to schools. These principles tend to express a lot of concern about how public and political debates on school quality are narrowing to a discussion of test scores. So, for example, one principal mentioned, the tests show a very small part of the picture. I feel that maybe it has become a little too much, that everything is measured only by them. It seems like the only thing people talk about, in a way, how the school performs at national tests. Clearly, it is important that pupils achieve basic skills, but there are many other things that are important here as well. And I think that the curriculum has swung and that it gets far too much attention compared to everything else that we have to do as well. It was often the case that they were referring to how local politicians, the media, and some parents increasingly use these test scores to evaluate and to compare schools. And this generated the fear that even some small and insignificant differences in performance can have real consequences for schools. For example, when they are used by external audiences, such as parents or by politicians, for example, to implement changes. So one principal mentioned, we, according to the value-added model, we are such a school. We perform well, but according to the student base we have, we should be able to perform better if you read those numbers a bit uncritically. And then I got a bit worried about it because we see that they take in. I got kind of nervous because politicians read numbers very easily and just look at some tables and think, okay, but then we do this and that. But when Statistics Norway explains how to read the value-added model, they provide a report of over 100 pages. For the sake of time, I will skip this. But what we see, this group of principals experiences some pressure to aim at high performance and to use achievement data, but they at the same time strongly disapprove of what they refer to as short-sighted solutions to quickly raise test scores, or for example, to put more emphasis on particular educational content. One principal mentioned, it might be that it's not more mathematics that you should have when you're bad at math. It might be that you need to have more arts or more crafts or more physical education. So these principles tend to reject also this prioritization of academic performance, and they really tend to emphasize inclusion and solidarity and creativity, as well as the practical and aesthetical subjects in their development projects. Still, they comply with the institutional expectation to use test data. So they have systems established where they make use of test data where they analyze test data together, but this still appears to remain a relatively isolated practice from their core activity. So the principals often do not take part in this. It's a group of teachers that does so, but in the meantime, it seems to have a very limited impact on their practices because the preference is still there that to adapt practices that we rely on teachers' judgment and sometimes also other types of tests, formative tests or tests designed by teachers, not necessarily standardized tests. So to conclude, what this study shows is in line with previous research that accountability policies are generating variation in school responses. I used reactivity as an analytical device to understand this variation and to explain responses. So this type of external high-stake consequences are more or less absent in Norway. So how can we understand the responses that we see? Well, on the one hand, we see that there's a group of principals that increasingly comes to see themselves and act according to the criteria of good practices that are embedded in standardized tests. So these tests are not neutral, but they carry particular values about the purposes of education and about good practices. What you see here is that these tests increasingly create what they are meant to describe. And there are a number of factors that can promote this internalization of criteria, of norms. On the one hand, the local accountability regime. So in local accountability regimes, we have a very long history of this type of PDBA demands and very closely aligned accountability tools. This can create really a culture and can create to a process of socialization where principals are increasingly socialized that this is what is expected of them. You also see that principals' professional trajectories play an important role here. It became apparent that many of the principals in the first category, they obtained their school leadership education at the Norwegian Business Institute rather than at a public university. They tended to agree a lot more with, for example, accountability, transparency, all the ideas basically of the accountability package. And this can also favor sort of internalization of performance metrics as proxies of professional success. But what can also happen is that principals that remain more critical of, or that do not internalize these test scores as proxies of professional success, they can still experience quite a lot of social pressure to conform to the expectations in the measures. And this can, for example, happen when these tests are increasingly seen as proxies of school quality, and the media, but also other actors play an important role here. So here you see also that the local accountability regime, but also the level of activity of the local press and school choice regulations can play an important role in contributing to this social pressure. Here it shouldn't say test create what they're meant to describe. That was part of the previous. And then finally, the hierarchy that standardized testing creates can also become a major lens through which principals evaluate their school and accordingly make decisions. So many principals agreed that the test did uncover an important truth about their school situation, about the effectiveness of their practices, and on the basis of that, they made decisions about how to adapt their practices. So to conclude, even in the absence of material consequences and low levels of marketization, standardized testing and performance-based accountability can really drive behavioral change, on the one hand by establishing new norms of good educational practices, and on the other hand by changing how educators make sense of core aspects of their work. And I will keep it here for the sake of time.